Good afternoon, everybody. Malgorzata Bonikowska, Center for International Relations. We are doing our Tuesday talks together with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Welcome. This one we are recording as the time difference is 10 hours between Poland and Australia, and the talk will be on Australia and Pacific. Let me welcome today great guests. We are so happy to have both of them with us. Professor Hugh White. Good afternoon. Good evening, Hugh.
Good afternoon. Lovely to be with you.
You are speaking to us from Canberra, so good
That's right.
to have you with us. And Professor Babones, Salvatore, good afternoon, good evening.
Hi, good to talk to you. Hello
Yes,
from Sydney.
Sydney, Canberra, Australia. We will cover the whole region, Australian Pacific. But from the European point of view, of course, we are interested in what's going on there. The topic we put is Australia, the West or the rest. It's a little bit, a question mark how you position yourself. And I just mentioned that both gentlemen are very, very well-known experts in the field. Hugh White has been to Poland at least once in 2019 for Warsaw Security Forum. He's an expert about security. That's his main domain. He's professor at Australian National University of Canberra. And the most important thing is to stress that he's an author of a book, which is also published in Polish, by the way, last year. The book is called in English original How to Defend Australia. And it has been an extremely interesting discussion around this book, as Hugh mentions necessity of changing the approach to the way how Australia thinks about its own defense. When Salvatore Babones is professor of sociology in Sydney University, our colleague and friend and expert also in the region, he's American, by the way, but it has been over a decade he lives in Australia. So I hope we can, combine the three views, European, American, and Australian. Okay, first question will go to Hugh. I just want to ask you, first of all, where is Australia now as far as COVID and the whole, situation in the country after this horrible 2020?
Well, I guess for us, like everyone else, it's been a very difficult year, but to be honest, Australia has been fairly fortunate so far. The numbers of people infected, the numbers of people killed have been very low around Australia. In the last few weeks, there's been very few cases of transmission of the virus. Indeed, that's partly a result of some very effective, very draconian lockdown measures in Victoria, in particular in Melbourne, the city of Melbourne. Towards the end of last year, there was a very long, complete lockdown to keep the number of cases down. But the result has been, and partly because, of course, we are an island, so it's easier to isolate ourselves.
But it's quite a big island, I must say.
Oh yes, well, it's a very big island, an island continent, but it still feels rather small when you can't leave it. This is a personal experience. The last 12 months has been the first 12 months that I haven't left the Australian continent since I was 18. So
Wow.
It's a very, very big change in our way of life, our way of thinking. But we have managed to keep the virus down. Our economy has been badly affected, like many others, by the virus, but it's recovering relatively strongly. So, sometimes Australia is sometimes called the lucky countries. So I'm not sure that's the right way to describe us, but so far we have been less badly affected by the COVID virus than many other countries, including, of course, many in Europe. And we are now just beginning the rollout of a vaccination program, which should see the whole country vaccinated by October, is the government's plan. So we're hoping that we'll get away with this without too much long-term disruption. But it's been a very difficult year for us nonetheless, and I think it's going to have some interesting long-term implications for politics and the way the country's organised.
Well, Australia will remain closed, as far as I understand, for some months to come.
Yes.
Salvatore, I just want you to summarize, if you can. Being an American, you follow very carefully the Australian political debate, and you are also a commentator to the Australian media. In this year, 2021, what are really the hot topics Australia discusses?
Oh, I'm actually not very well placed to answer that. I'm not much of an expert on Australian politics. I do live in Australia and I've been here 13 years. But what we're going into for this year, I really have to defer to Hugh. Maybe Hugh can give us a little more on that.
Well,
Okay, Hugh.
so Salvatore, I think there's a couple of things. Obviously, the pandemic, COVID, is right at the top of the political agenda. The way in which the government in Canberra is handling it, the way in which the individual state governments are handling it, because Australia is a federation, and a lot of the responsibilities for delivering health services, for example, and management of the pandemic has been with the states. So there's been a lot of debate about that. Always, of course, there's a big debate about the economy. As I mentioned before, the Australian economy has recovered reasonably well from the pandemic, but there's a big set of questions in Australia about what kind of economic reforms we should be taking to bring ourselves out of the pandemic-induced slowdown better. There's a very big and very complicated and very, frankly, unsatisfactory debate in Australia about climate change. We are a very hot country. Just 12 months ago, we had some catastrophic bushfires, which really brought home to a lot of Australians the significance of climate change, as the bushfires were very strongly worsened by high temperatures and low rainfall. And the whole question about where Australia sits, both as a major exporter, particularly of coal, and a big per capita emitter of carbon, but at the same time, a country that's being heavily affected by climate change, and a very difficult political debate where the political system is finding it very hard to wrestle with the challenges that all countries face with climate change. That's a big issue. And last, but by no means least, there is the question of what's happening in Asia and the rise of China. Now, well, I'm sure we'll talk about this some more.
Yes, that's our main topic. We'll come back to that, but I
just come back to that.
Yeah, to put the question to Salvatore concerning the hot debate we were following in Europe, but I guess everybody was following, that the controversy between Australian government and Facebook and Google, and all these restrictions, which I think ended, as far as I understand, with some compromise.
On hiatus, let's say. Australia passed in January a media bargaining code, which effectively pointed out or singled out Facebook and Google as targets. That is, they're the only two companies in the world that qualified for coverage under the code as being dominant media platforms or platforms for the propagation of media. And they were both targeted with a threat that the government would effectively impose a tax on them in order to support Australian media. And it was pretty vague what Australian media. So obviously the newspapers, but also TV was included. And despite the fact that TV isn't facing any particular financial crisis, even the question was, were community organizations considered media? And at one point, Facebook even panicked and said, well, for all we know, provision of government information is media. It was pretty vague. And so they exerted a lot of pressure on both Google and Facebook to come to terms with Australian media companies for the payment of news. Now, that's similar to what's happened in Spain. In Spain, Facebook simply pulled out, and there's no Google News. I'm sorry, Google simply pulled out. There's no Google News in Spain as a result of the demands to pay. France, of course, had its its news tax on hold for a year, and they finally then this January, at the same time as Australia, came to terms with Google. The question is, the moral question is, should the government be essentially socking it to foreign companies to pay for local news? And then the technological question is, ultimately, how far will Google and Facebook go to please the Australian government? At some point, they still reserve the right ultimately to pull the plug on news in Australia. Facebook did pull the plug for about a week and then went back to the bargaining table. We'll see how it turns out.
Yeah, somebody puts in the newspaper that Australia is a place, it's a battlefield. It's like a tester also for the others, because we in Europe also discuss, what to do in these in similar cases.
Well, anyway, I want to make my position on this very clear. In a free market for the placement of snippets, we're not talking about Google and Facebook somehow illegally showing news stories that are not publicly available. They're showing those little snippets, a headline, an author, a photo. In a free market for snippets, news companies would be paying Google and Facebook to feature their material. All other advertisers pay Google and Facebook to feature their material. So far, because of the political sensitivities around news, Google and Facebook and other media companies have not charged to feature these snippets. Now, countries have gotten very, I think it's very easy to sock it to the multinational, and they've decided that they're going to exert pressure on these deep-pocketed multinationals to pay for the news. I think that's really disingenuous of them. If they want the news, they should be supporting quality journalism instead of demanding that someone external to the country support it for themselves.
Well, I ask about it because, of course, that's a new dimension of, activity of the states and the businesses as well. Facebook is used monthly by 2,700,000,000 people.
Sure.
It's just an incredible number. Twitter, which is the most popular among politicians, is 350 million users. And well, the role of the social media, it's more and more important also for the security, because we are discussing more and more the new threats in security field. Cybersecurity, of course, but also information wars and disinformation as a phenomenon. So going to Hugh now, because your book is, I think, the key book for understanding now the Australian debate about security. I would like you to comment on 2021, because there may be some lessons from 2020, from the pandemic time, for your thinking about what you put in your book before pandemic even started in 2019. Do you now have any difference of opinion because pandemic showed something new?
Well, look, that's a really interesting question. The starting point of the book was an argument that the assumptions upon which Australia's approach to defending itself had been based for many decades were no longer valid. And those assumptions were essentially that the United States would remain the dominant power in East Asia and the Western Pacific, in our part of the world. That its position there would prevent any major power attacking Australia, because America is an ally of Australia's. We have same kind of relationship, very broadly speaking, as the NATO powers have with the United States. And that therefore we didn't need to worry about defending ourselves from a major power like China. And that if
a little
somehow,
bit like the situation of Europe, I just want to stress that we look at Australia also, we find similarities as far as this approach.
Oh, that's right. There are similarities. We depend on the United States as European countries do, and we wonder whether the United States will be there for us as European countries do. But for Australians, there's been a very deep level of confidence in America, a very strong emotional connection. It's the English speaking thing, of course. It's the sense that we've been close allied with the United States since 1941, when the Pacific War broke out, and so it's very deep emotional attachment. At the same time, we're very worried about China. We feel ourselves to be directly exposed to China's rising power and its rising ambitions. And the argument I was making in my book was that Australia could no longer afford to assume that America would be there to defend us against China in the future. And we therefore needed to work out how to defend ourselves, hence the title of the book, How to Defend Australia. Now, you asked how did the pandemic change my thinking about that? Really only to reaffirm in my mind the urgency of the issue, because notwithstanding all the other factors that are going on, I think right at the heart of the pandemic is the risk that it accelerates the trends which seem to me to make China's rise more threatening and America's and our capacity to rely on the United States lower. And that's because in the broad, China has done better out of the pandemic than America has, that it has accelerated the shift in the balance of power between the two countries in China's favor. And it has reinforced those tendencies in the United States, which make the United States less likely to be willing to bear the costs and risks required to effectively resist China in China's ambitions in East Asia. And that means that we come closer to the point at which Australia will really have to look after itself. And we therefore have to think more carefully about what we need to do in order to do that.
Yeah, before this talk, we put on there, some statistics is showing that Australian public opinion, Australian society is more and more worried about China. It is raising in the recent 2 years. Definitely, the numbers went up as far as how Australian judge China, that they are really afraid. And then even the trust in the Chinese leader Xi Jinping went down. So it's less and less trust in this kind of politics he's proposing to the world. Salvatore, I want to ask you, because you have been doing research on China. It has been a while. You published also several articles and a book on China, or on America and China relations. What would be your understanding of the Chinese politics?
Well, first, I'm a skeptic on China. That is, I think China's rise really reached a peak in around 2017. I think it's leveled off. I think the economy is leveled off. I think we've seen clearly that other countries around China are arming against it. That is, it's the time when China had a free ride, or when its neighbors would simply overlook its hostility in order to win business. Those days are over. I mean, Japan has converted its helicopter carriers to converting its helicopter carriers to handle fixed-wing aircraft, potentially the F-35s. South Korea is now talking about building an aircraft carrier. Of course, India has an aircraft carrier and massive naval modernization program. China is facing pressure on all sides, and from the United States, its technology base is being eroded. Not America's, China's, that is. I mean, we just saw the news this weekend of HSMC, the big semiconductor manufacturer in Wuhan, finally being put out of its misery. It's been dissolved by the provincial government. So I'm not that concerned, honestly, about the rise of China at this point. I think everywhere, including here in Australia, where a raft of new legislation has been passed guarding against Chinese influence. Now, they never say Chinese. Foreign influence, but the one foreign everyone's concerned about is China, guarding against foreign influence in Australian politics and society. So everyone's on their guard against China. I don't think we need to worry about it so much anymore.
Well, we can say, you're American, so maybe you are biased because you believe, as far as I understand, that the American power will remain for, at least 50 or 100.
All I can say is I'm the only American who thinks that. Everyone else in the American literature are declinists. I'm the only one who thinks the American system is, not the only one, but I'm one of the few who thinks the American system is inherently very stable, and that China is actually fragile as opposed to powerful and menacing.
Well, Hugh, just to quote these statistics, 81% of the Australian population now has negative view on China, which is an increase from 2019, where only 57% of the people thought that way. So it means Australians really think different than Salvatore. They see China as a threat. Could you elaborate more? Could you just present more your concept of how to defend Australia? In case you put the assumption that it may happen in this decade, that might be a war between China and Australia.
Well, let's start with a question about those perceptions of China that you mentioned, and you're right. The perceptions of China and Australia have deteriorated quite sharply in the last while, and I think there are two reasons for that. The first is the behaviour of China. China has been acting very aggressively towards Australia in the last 12 months in particular. It has imposed some really significant limits on Australian trade across a whole range of different commodities. This is extraordinarily important for Australia because China is our #1 trade partner. At the moment, it's taking almost half of all of Australia's exports, and Australia has a very open economy. It's a very export-oriented economy, and many of the commodities and things we sell to China have been restricted. The big one that hasn't been restricted is iron ore. Iron ore is our biggest single export to China, and that hasn't been affected. In fact, that's going very well. But Australians have felt that China has been bullying them by imposing these restrictions in retaliation for things that the Chinese believe we have done to them. So that's one thing that's certainly made Australians more fearful of China. The other thing has been the way the Australian government's side of things. For a very long time, the Australian government went out of its way to reassure Australians that we had nothing to fear from China. There was a very strong tendency to think, as China became more and more important for us economically, that the great slogan of Australian political leaders was, we don't have to choose between America and China. The assumption was that China could keep on growing, it would become richer and richer, that it would buy more and more of our exports, but that it wouldn't challenge the United States, that the United States would remain the leading power in Asia, that we could be confident that America's strength would prevent China posing any threat to us, even as its power grew. And just over the last 2 or 3 years in particular, Australian governments have abandoned that optimism, have started to become very worried about China. As Salvatore says, it's become very focused on China's attempts to influence Australia politically, passing legislation, which, as he said, though it wasn't labelled that way, was clearly focused on China. So on the one hand, Australians have found the Chinese behaving more threateningly, and on the other, you've found the Australian government no longer speaking reassuringly about China. And the third factor, I guess, is that there has been a decline in confidence in the United States. Now, at the superficial level, that's got a lot to do with Donald Trump, of course, and Trump's erratic conduct. And I think, you know, here as elsewhere, Trump's era in the White House was bad for the confidence of American allies in America's will and capacity. But I also think there are deeper factors at work. And this goes to this really important point that Salvatore mentioned. You know, there are different ways of assessing China. Certainly one can't be confident, we can't be sure that China's going to keep growing for the next few decades the way it has for the last few decades. But on balance, I think a lot of people in Australia, and I'd be one of them, believe that it's prudent to expect that China will keep growing, that it hasn't peaked. People have been saying that China's peaked ever since it started to grow. And the fact is that it is now, including by the Australian government's own calculations, it is continuing to go strongly. It has overtaken the United States to have the biggest economy in the world in PPP terms. It almost certainly will overtake the United States to become the biggest economy in the world in market exchange rate terms. Its military capabilities are growing fast, and I would say faster than those of the countries around it. And although, as Salvatore says, many countries in Asia, not just Australia, are getting worried about China and are starting to push back, it's unclear that they're pushing back hard enough or in a sufficiently coordinated way to really resist China's growing power. So the anxieties in Australia about what it's going to be like for us to live in an Asia in which China has emerged as the world's strongest economy, the region's strongest economy, and a really serious challenger to America's position in Asia. That's very worrying for Australians. Ever since the European settlement in 1788, 230 something years, either Britain or America has been the dominant power in our part of the world. And so for the first time, except for during the Pacific War in 1941 to 1945, for the first time other than that, we now find ourselves contemplating an Asia which is not dominated by an Anglo-Saxon power. And for Australians, that's very worrying. It's very unsettling. We have to rethink our place in Asia. And that's the process that we're trying to wrestle with at the moment.
It's really a completely different situation, but for this situation, you also propose very radical solutions, which are quite controversial as well and discussed, like you propose, you know, the nuclear power for Australia. But before we go into this, I want Salvatore to comment on the economic factor, because that's something you study. Your research on Chinese economy brought you to the conclusion that it's not maybe so optimistic for China as Hugh is saying. What is your perspective of the China's growth?
Well, first, I think, you know, Hugh hasn't said he's optimistic. Hugh has said, correct me if I'm wrong, that it's a possibility that must be guarded against, that China will continue to grow. Whether it will or not, you know, of course, who knows? I'm a sociologist. Why ask me? But I have been writing consistently since 2010 that China's trajectory is to be converging to the middle income tier of the world economy by 2020. And that's been my message for the last 10 years. Now, I may be a sociologist, but I'm a sociologist who studies middle income countries and their economies. China's middle income economy has become pretty typical of other middle income countries, like especially like Mexico. If you want a good paradigm for China, look at Mexico. Mexico is still richer than China on a per capita basis. China in many ways is like a dozen Mexicos stacked on top of each other, an export dependent large economy that's highly corrupt, that has, you know, very inefficient allocation of capital with lots of state direction in the economy. And Xi Jinping seems to have doubled down on that. Now, anyone who thinks that China is going to continue to grow rapidly to me has to implicitly argue that a state-directed economy is the route to economic prosperity in the 21st century, because China's stopped liberalizing. I mean, we could have argued that if China continued to liberalize, it could make the transition towards a 21st century style market economy, but Xi Jinping's gone the other way. He's put the clamps down on the Chinese economy. He's controlling it. Well, especially for people in Eastern Europe who have the experience of state management of the economy, I just have to ask people, is that what you think is likely to succeed in the future of economic competition? Now, I don't think the evidence suggests that. But I can be proved wrong. Anyone can be wrong. And Hugh's right that maybe it does make sense to be cautious. That's why in debating, if we were debating Hugh's book, for example, it's a great book. I encourage everyone to buy it. It's the question for me is simply, is it realistic to think of Australia being in Asia? That is, if Hugh's book were written by someone in Japan, I entirely endorse the argument. I just don't see Australia as being in Asia. In fact, you right now, Malgorzata, are closer to Beijing than we are.
Well, that's an interesting argument. Hugh, would you like to comment on that?
Oh yes, well, it's in some ways it goes right to the heart of the whole question. Let me just pick up a couple of the points Salvatore just made. The first point, of course, I think he's right. The most probable trajectory for China is that it does, like so many other countries, find itself sort of stuck in that middle income position. The difference with China is that it's got 1 and a bit billion people. And when it's stuck in middle income, it still has an economy bigger than America's. And that makes it the first country since about 1880 to have an economy bigger than America's. And that does give it a great deal of power. Now, that's not to say that China can challenge America and rule the world. I don't believe it can. I do believe it makes it the most powerful country in Asia, the most powerful Asian country we've seen since the Europeans really erupted into this part of the world some centuries ago. And therefore, I think, I think that's why I think we need to take that possibility seriously. As for Australia, we are a very strange country because my ancestors, came to this continent and more or less, disinherited the indigenous population, turned it into an Anglo-Saxon country, with very strong historical and cultural and linguistic and political and strategic ties with Britain and then later with America. And it was really only after the Second World War that we started paying attention to where we were geographically. So there was a very deep split between our economy and our geography.
Everybody in Poland realizes that Australia has still the Queen Elizabeth II as a head of state, right?
Oh yes, that's right. And Australians, although Australia is now a very multicultural society, and we've taken immigrants from many parts of the world, including quite a few from Poland. We still remain very much an English-speaking country with very Westminster-style political systems, and our political leadership across the board still very strongly identifies, and I think our country as a whole very strongly identifies with the Anglosphere, with the Anglo-American approach to world affairs. But at the same time, we are, as Salvatore says, I mean, Asia is a big place and Australia is a pretty remote place. So we're not geographically as close as you might think. But there are two factors that draw us closer. The first is that this is a very maritime part of the world. And the reason we feel closer to China than you do is that the sea transport is so important. That's why Australian iron ore gets to China, because we can get there by sea. And the second factor is that that's where our trade takes us. Australia is overwhelmingly economically focused on Asia, and particularly these days on Northeast Asia and China above all. And so that means that draws us into Asia. And I think it's fair to say that we still haven't resolved in our own minds this question about where we sit. Are we an Asian country? Are we not an Asian country? I would say that Australians find that extremely difficult question, and it's one that becomes harder and harder the more it seems likely in future that Asia will not be dominated and made safe for us by Anglo-Saxon power, by American power, but will be dominated and run primarily by Asian powers, and particularly by China. And that seems to be the future that we're heading towards. Now, if that's right, Australia is going to have to work out a new way of relating to Asia, which is not mediated by our great and powerful friends like America. And you might say the drama of Australian foreign policy today is the efforts we're making to try and rethink our way into Asia, into an Asia which is dominated not by outside powers, Anglo-Saxon powers, great and powerful English-speaking friends, but by Asian countries themselves, and especially China.
Yeah, well, if you look at the map you can buy in China, where China is the middle of the world, Australia is very much there. It's also in the middle, because it's the middle of Pacific. So we Europeans are really very much on the corner in this world. So we have to learn maybe the new geography for ourselves. We have to rediscover Pacific. But Salvatore, I want to go to you to comment on this economic power of China, because we know that China uses this tool for expansion, for political reasons as well. We are following very carefully what's the situation in South China Sea. But we know that also in Pacific, in the region around Australia, the Chinese influence, economic influence, and also financial investments, going with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is now the flagship initiative of the government of Beijing. Could you comment on this extension or expansion of the economic power of China in the region, please?
Well, the latest scare here in Australia is that a Chinese company has announced plans to build a major fishing port in New Guinea, just off the coast of Australia, just a few miles, almost the shortest point between Australia and Asia. So that could be China coming to Australia's waters sometime soon. Of course, if it did build a port, it wouldn't be a fishing port. It would be an intelligence gathering port, a place for it to put maybe false flagged or civilian flagged, I should say, Chinese ships to do surveillance on Australia. Whether it might ultimately become some kind of outright military base, who knows, but it hasn't been built yet. And that it hasn't been built yet is pretty much the answer to everything having to do with Belt and Road. I mean, if you look at the #1 priority of Belt and Road, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, virtually no progress in the last 10 years on building the port at Gwadar. The one highway they built, the Karakoram Highway, ended up getting submerged by a glacial lake. And they've had to rebuild it entirely to go around this new lake that formed because of shifting landslides and glaciers in the area. I mean, even if you look at my own research on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that was billed as China's massive plan to rebuild Asia's infrastructure, $100 billion in capital. In fact, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has only made about $12 or $15 billion in loans. Its $100 billion in capital, in theory, could have made $1 trillion in loans, but if it's only made about $15 billion in loans, it hasn't called up the capital. And if you look in detail at what it's actually building, so you see these maps of Belt and Road, and it looks like China's got a road here and a belt there and a sea lane here. And if you look at the actual projects, they're much more mundane. A busway in Jakarta, a sewage treatment plant in India, an electric power station. These are not a joined up plan to connect Asia. These are a random set of development projects for projects that will use Chinese exporters. It's an export-import bank function, essentially. So there's the rhetoric, there's the big plans, and I don't deny that China has these big plans, but when you go on the ground and see what they've done, it's really quite underwhelming.
Sorry, that's an interesting statement, because normally, while we follow the Chinese investments, we can see that China buys strategic places, especially in the weaker countries. In Europe, it was Greece. During especially
Piraeus is the one success story. I mean, Piraeus has been an enormous success for China, and it stands out as the enormous success. Look at the rest of Eastern Europe. Why has 17+1 fallen apart? Because China hasn't delivered on all those promised packages.
That's true, but going back to the region, Asia and Pacific, we have a lot of, small islands as well, where
Yeah.
China really is quite active. Hugh, would you agree with what Salvatore said, which I understood is a little bit like, don't worry, China is having this One Belt, One Road, but in essence, it's not much, which is done.
Look, I do agree with Salvatore that the performance is a good deal short of the rhetoric. And I think that's I think that's significant. The sort of grandiose idea of China building this vast infrastructural network, which would become, if you like, the sinews or the nerves of a new Chinese empire, I think has proved exaggerated. And I think that's good news as far as it goes. On the other hand, I'm not so optimistic as he is. I think that that doesn't mean that China's influence is nonetheless expanding. And in particular, what the growth in China's economy and the significance of its place as the primary trade partner for every country in Asia, and not just the primary trade partner now, but the most plausible source of future economic opportunities in the future, plus Beijing's willingness to use that as a political tool, a political weapon, does seem to me to give China a great deal of influence. And so if we look, for example, at Japan, of course, Japan is deeply worried about China's rise and is very, very, anxious about the kinds of threats that China has been posing towards Japan in the Senkaku's, Diaoyu Islands and so on. Nonetheless, the Japanese are working very hard to manage their relationship with China in a way that doesn't get in the way of Japan's economic opportunities there. And that does give China real influence. So at a time when Washington is talking up China as a strategic rival, Japan is working as hard as it can to secure a visit to Tokyo by Xi Jinping later this year, if the pandemic allows. And I think that I don't think the Japanese are wrong to do that. I think it's very important for Japan to manage that relationship with China, and it's always going to be perceived differently from Tokyo than it is from Washington, for example. But I do think that the sheer gravitational pull of China's economic scale has already given it a great deal of political influence throughout the region, including in Australia. And I think that's likely to continue growing. So whilst the grandiose, big ticket plans, the sort of, BRI, Belt and Road Initiative sort of plans might not deliver as much as is promised, the raw fact of economic mass, I think, is making China not just a very powerful country in Asia, but a uniquely powerful country in Asia. It's a kind of country in Asia that we have not seen since Australia was founded. And that's why, as a European colony, and that's why this challenge for us at the moment in thinking our way through what that means for our place in Asia is so new and so difficult.
Well, it's a completely new situation. You're right. I want also to quote some statistic concerning the debts, the situation of some countries which are now really dependent on China. The Kiel Institute research shows that as far as the world is concerned, there are 7 countries who have the debts at the level of 25% of their GDP to China. In Asia, it's Laos, Cambodia, Kyrgyzstan, and Maldives. And we have also 3 countries in Africa, Djibouti, Niger, and the Republic of Congo. So that's a direct, dependence on the foreign power. And of course, this politics, as far as I understand, China is continuing. So, Salvatore, you are not agreeing.
When you lend to a sovereign, it's the sovereign who has all the power because the sovereign can decide whether or not to pay you back. And so Laos being in debt to China doesn't make Laos nervous. It makes China nervous that it won't get its money back. China is the one having to write down these loans. Also, we're talking about places that have, forgive me, I don't want to insult anyone who may be from these countries, but in the larger scale, absolutely no strategic significance for world peace or world power, whether that's the South Pacific Islands or Laos or any of the countries that have been caught in debt trap diplomacy. And whenever I talk to strategic studies people, and I'm not speaking about Hugh specifically, we haven't discussed this, but in general, when I talk to people, they'll always say such and such is an extraordinarily strategic place. And my response is always to challenge them. what isn't an extraordinarily strategic place? I mean, Japan is extraordinarily strategic. South Korea, Taiwan, extraordinarily strategic. Palau, not that strategic, really.
Not so much.
Laos, not not that strategic, right? You know, I think we should see things in perspective. Look, I'm not saying that we shouldn't take China seriously as a threat. It's mainly a threat to the internal stability of countries because Chinese money has undermined political systems, including in Australia. And countries have started to protect themselves against that. So for a while, Chinese money was everywhere in Australian politics. Now I think you'd have trouble finding an Australian politician who was brave enough to accept a Chinese bribe, because you know, now it's come back to haunt people that they've accepted money from China and China-linked organizations. And I think everyone's, you know, it took a few years. If you talked to me 5 years ago, I would have, even 3 years ago, I would have been warning against, you know, this dramatic expansion of China's money in domestic politics in Western democracies. But I think we've now gotten wise to that. It's really, there's been a lot of pushback, and China is going to find that it's spent a lot of money to buy friends that no longer have any influence.
Well, but I think we are all worried because definitely China is seen also by the Europeans as an opportunity, business opportunity.
Right.
It's still not seen, as the Americans put it now, a total rival, right?
Sure.
So it's a question mark.
Sure.
I believe the Australians also could look the situation the same way, because China is the major economic partner of Australia. So Hugh,
Sure.
what would you, how would you comment on this?
Look, it's a really important point, because you know, over the last the 3 years since the US National Security Strategy of 2017, which declared China to be a strategic rival of the United States, Australian political leaders have been very careful, because their instinct, of course, is always to align very closely with the United States. And because of their worries about China, they're keen to draw the United States more and more closely into the region, promoting the Quad and so on. But on the other hand, they are very careful not to be too overtly aligned with the United States, because of the damage that will do to our economic relationship with China. So last year, as the Chinese were putting limits on Australia's exports, precisely because the Chinese were accusing us of lining up with the United States as a strategic rival of China, the Australian government was being very careful to say, no, we are not following the United States in this. We don't take that same view. Now, I personally think that's a bit incoherent. Australia does see China as a strategic rival, because we see our security depending on maintaining American leadership in Asia, and China's clearly trying to undermine that. But it's the unwillingness of Australian governments to put that forward, to really confront China as a strategic rival, is an index of how important they see China being to our economic future. And even very conservative and very pro-American Australian political leaders, like the former Prime Minister John Howard, who was Prime Minister from 96 through to 2007, and has a kind of a very revered status, particularly on the conservative side of Australian politics. He has been very explicit in warning the present government that we must maintain a good relationship with China no matter what. Now, it's easy for him to say that. He doesn't give them many hints as to how to do it, but I think it does show that the economic weight of China is making countries throughout the region very cautious about how far they go. So as Salvatore said, the government's pushed back, for example, against perceptions of Chinese political influence in Australia in terms of political donations and so on. But there's no getting around the fact that when Beijing is angry, they can really make Australian governments jump, because of their capacity to use Australia's export dependence on China as a political weapon, which is what they've been doing.
We follow also this tension between Australia and China after the decision of the government of Australia to support this neutral investigation in China about the virus, right?
That's right, yeah. Yes,
I've got to tell you about it. Go on, finish, please.
Hugh, then Salvatore.
That's right. One of the things that happened last year, which pushed the relationship between Canberra and Beijing into its present deep freeze, was the Australian government's very overt advocacy of a neutral international inquiry in terms which the Chinese interpreted as pointing the finger at China as to blame for the pandemic. But it's worth bearing in mind that's only one of the things that the Chinese are complaining about. There was Australia's decision not to allow Huawei to provide equipment for our 5G rollout, which we didn't just do, but we also, so to speak, encouraged other countries to exclude Huawei. There was the legislation aimed at curtailing Chinese political influence in Australia, which was seen by the Chinese as directed against them, I think correctly, and a whole series of other things that the Australian government did, which despite the care that Australian governments have at times taken not to irritate China, not to offend China in order to protect our trade, the fact is they've nonetheless managed to offend China, and our trade has nonetheless suffered. And this, if you like, really demonstrates what a difficult political tightrope our Australian government is trying to walk. And I don't think at the moment they're doing a very good job.
Salvatore?
And the coronavirus investigation fiasco illustrates everything Hugh just said about the Australian government's position. The Australian government did demand an independent investigation into the coronavirus. It settled for a World Health Organization investigation into the coronavirus, an investigation that China itself signed on to, and that China has thoroughly stage managed the investigation. And and Australia has made no public complaints about this because of fears of further upsetting China. So there is that very careful, we all know Australia is protecting itself against China, but we never say the word China. Don't do anything further. And there's very much an atmosphere here of major figures in government, in former government, Kevin Rudd, in business, saying, please don't offend China anymore. Don't say anything else to offend China, which is kind of funny to watch since it's China doing the offending. I mean, China presented Australia with virtually a 14-point ultimatum back in November of a list of demands that China had if Australia wanted to restore good relations. Australia hasn't done anything to China. When people talk about an Australia-China trade war, so no, it's a China trade assault on Australia. There's no war about it. Australia hasn't done anything in response except say, please no more assaults.
Hugh, I just want to go back to the security aspect, because we know that we have this Quad dialogue when there is United States, Australia, Japan, and India. We haven't talked yet about Indo-Pacific concept, which is very much promoted by the Americans in the region. And Hugh, could you comment a little bit on how you see India in this picture? Yeah,
look, it's a really important question, and very central to understanding where the region's going. The Indo-Pacific concept, that is the idea that the strategic system we're talking about in Asia today is one that extends all the way from India to America and incorporates all the countries in between, has become very important to the way in which countries like Australia and Japan and the United States, and to a certain extent India, have begun to see their strategic future. And it's if you like, I see it as an expression of optimism. That is an expression that these countries and others, but these core countries in particular, can cooperate together to push back against China's ambitions to become the leading power in the region. And because of the weight they carry, particularly Japan and India, they can really bolster America's power and help to, if you like, restore the balance between America and China. I'm myself not optimistic about that, because the Quad concept presupposes that India in particular, which is the most important other element other than America, of course, because of its sheer scale and economic weight, that India will see its interests served by confronting China, not just in the Indian Ocean, but in East Asia and the Western Pacific. And I'm very unsure about that. I'm sure that India will do whatever it takes to prevent China dominating India and India's own region in South Asia and Indian Ocean. But I don't think India has a very strong interest in what happens in the Western Pacific and East Asia. And so although I think it would be nice to think that these four countries can cooperate together, I think the reality is that India is off to one side. And the question is not whether these countries are willing to meet, as we expect them to meet next week at head of government level or head of state level for the first time. That's a significant diplomatic step, if I can put it that way, but I don't think it carries much strategic weight, because I don't see much reason to expect those countries to really be willing to cooperate together against China when the chips are down. And one way of thinking about that in more vivid terms is to say, well, imagine, and it's not a hypothetical question, imagine that China does move militarily against Taiwan sometime in the next few years. Would India be willing to commit forces to support the United States? Would Australia be willing to commit forces to the United States? For that matter, would Japan be willing to commit forces to support the United States in a war with China over Taiwan? I think it's very unclear whether that would be the case. I'm sure India wouldn't. I don't think it's very likely that Australia would. I'm not even sure that Japan would. And if that's the case, then whilst the diplomacy is nice as far as it goes, it doesn't add real strategic weight for what is fundamentally a very strategic power political contest in Asia as to which country is going to be the dominant power in the Western Pacific in the decades to come.
I think, we have to put to ourselves these questions. They might seem like a little bit radical, but I think that's exactly the moment to put these questions, because we are all watching the situation in Taiwan. First, we watch the situation in Hong Kong, and of course we see the consequences. Salvatore, from your perspective, because we have the Portuguese presidency in the European Union, and Portuguese presidency brings India also at the front, because the argument is that we earlier we had the strategic partnership with India signed in 2004, but not many things really happened between the European Union and India, and now it's the high time really to make many more efforts to be closer. You will be writing a next book on India. What is your understanding?
I don't think the European Union has much to do with India. France has a lot to do with India, and France has been deeply involved in India's armed forces modernization, also in its major infrastructure projects in high-speed rail in India and in power systems, power networks in India. So I think France has really taken the lead among European countries in developing India, not just as a market, but also as a partner. That said, I don't think France necessarily wants to share the spoils with the rest of Europe. I mean, it may be a very pleasant vision of European unity, but these are French companies that are, and closely state-linked companies that are making potentially big money, certainly large-scale contracts in India, developing connections and embedding themselves in India. And I think they're likely to succeed even further. I mean, looking beyond the Rafale fighter jet contract between India and France and the submarine contracts between India and France, looking even further beyond that, I think many Indians rightly see the United States as an unreliable partner. I mean, if Hugh is worried about Australia not being able to depend on the United States, I think certainly India should be worried that the United States is not a reliable partner for India. But France, on the other hand, is potentially a very reliable partner. So I see a lot of close contacts developing between France and India, which is a European issue, but not really a European Union issue.
Well, but European Union, of course, doesn't have much power as far as security yet, but we have this concept of PESCO, and we are trying to be more, autonomous. We have this concept of strategic autonomy. Sure. Let's see how this goes. But my point was more about how we see India, and also as India, as Hugh mentioned, is India ready to act? Because we are worried that India plays a swing state. That's the concept, that India doesn't have a very clear, radical direction to the West.
I think that's fine. Look, I'm going to plug, Hugh's been too polite to plug his book. I'm going to plug it, How to Defend Australia. I encourage everyone to read it. The basic logic of the book, if you take it to its final conclusion, is not choosing between China and America or this sort of thing, choosing the West or choosing Russia and China. It's the principle that countries should look out for their own defense. Now, as looking at things from the American standpoint, the US State Department always wants to see the world as a stage on which it manages everything. But the fact is, it's fantastic for the United States if India defends itself, if Japan defends itself, if Australia defends itself. Those are all big wins for the United States. So whether or not a country aligns with the United States from the American standpoint really shouldn't even be an issue. I mean, the question about India is not, will India anchor itself in the Western camp? I mean, India has a 70-year relationship with Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union, that it's not going to give up just to be nominally in the Western camp. But what bad does that do for the Western camp? In fact, it's good for the Western camp. I mean, the real challenge, I think, that all of us who very much want to take on the moral struggle against China and Russia, and and that Hugh White, Hugh, myself, you, or we're all on the same page about the real threat. Forgive me, is Europe. And the real threat, if I had to pick one country that's the biggest threat to the Western alliance, it's Germany.
Well, let's not continue this quite controversial statement.
Sure.
Go back to Asia and Pacific. Hugh, I want you to end our discussion with a perspective for the years to come, because, of course, your book is about the future, not about the past. So taking into consideration all what we've discussed and also the pandemic, what would be your assessment, your prediction for the next months, and what are your recommendations how to behave towards all these phenomena, China, US rivalry, which definitely will continue, and what is the Biden effect? What do you expect from the Biden administration?
No, look, it's a really good question. I mean, I do think that the most important single question is the trajectory of the US-China relationship over the months and years ahead. I think that the pattern from the Chinese side is pretty clear. I do think China has a very clear agenda to become the dominant power, at least in East Asia and the Western Pacific, and that does put it in direct confrontation with an America which at least presumes that it wants to retain its traditional position as the leading power in that part of the world. Now, what we saw under the Trump administration was a very uncertain response. On the one hand, rhetorically, the Trump administration declared China as a strategic rival. But it did, and as we know now from the documents that they released publicly just before the inauguration of the Biden administration, they said preserving American primacy in East Asia is its #1 objective. On the other hand, very little that the Trump administration actually did promoted that objective. So the question is, will the Biden administration have the same objective, and what will they do to support it? Now, my view is that the Biden administration, although they've picked up a lot of the rhetoric about China, is much less sure about how they really want to react. They're more focused on trying to cooperate with China. They certainly don't want to give way to China, but they talk about competing with China where they must, but cooperating where they can. And I don't myself think that the question about whether the Biden administration is really going to push back hard against China has yet been resolved. If they do, they're going to have to commit a lot more resources than the US has done so far. The Pentagon budget now before Congress commits something like $26 or $27 billion over 6 years. That's $4 billion a year. That's nothing. In a strategic contest between the two most powerful states in the world, an extra $4 billion a year does nothing. They're going to have to really do something big if they're going to push back effectively against China. And I don't so far see the willingness to do that. So on the one hand, I'm pessimistic that America is going to mobilize the effort required to respond more effectively than they have hitherto to China's strategic challenge in East Asia. On the other hand, I think the chances of a confrontation leading to a crisis, leading to a conflict, is quite high. And in part, that's because I fear that the guys in Beijing will perceive Biden as weak and hesitant, that they will therefore see this as a moment of opportunity for them to push America hard, that they will undertake provocations in the South China Sea or over Taiwan, and Biden will not back down, he'll push forward. And then we will have, that's where it does get a bit like 1914. situation where powers both push into a crisis expecting the other to give way, and neither gives way. And that could really be a disaster. That would be a disaster, because I don't think a war with China is one that a war with America is one that China can win, and I don't think a war with China is one that America can win, but they can both lose very badly, and so can the rest of us.
Yeah, we've noticed that in the media in Australia, this perception of Biden as weak is quite popular, and I wonder if this is the case, or if this is a disinformation also inspired by some external powers. Salvatore, what is your expectation about Biden administration?
Oh, I agree with Hugh. I think there's a lot of pressure within the Biden administration, or I shouldn't say within the administration, I don't have inside sources, but among its supporters for rapprochement with China. Now, that's primarily Wall Street and the tech companies who really would like to see, and they're both big Democratic Party supporters. Both groups would like to see some kind of rapprochement with China. Of course, the Trump administration, and especially the outgoing Secretary of State, were very effective, I think, in tying Biden's hands. It would be politically almost inconceivable at this point for Biden not to maintain the level of pressure that we currently see on China. And I think that's actually about right. I recently wrote for Foreign Policy that China, the danger right now is that the US will push too hard on China. I think the semiconductor sanctions, the technology sanctions have really been very effective. I think China is feeling very squeezed right now. And the thing we all want to avoid is China taking a throw of the dice, lashing out, thinking there's nothing to lose by starting some kind of conflict. And I think the best thing might actually be what is likely to happen under the Biden administration, which is keeping the Trump pressure in place, but no new pressure, and slowly dialing down the pressure that exists over time, but so slowly that nobody notices. And I think that may actually be the best strategy.
Let's see then. Let's see what will happen in the months to come. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. It was really a pleasure. Salvatore Babones, University of Sydney, and Hugh White, National University. Hugh White, How to Defend Australia, recently published also in Polish, and Salvatore, American Tianxia, and now working on the book on India. So we strongly recommend all these books to whoever is interested, not only in the region, but in the global politics. Thank you very much, both the gentlemen. Thank you all for watching. See you next Tuesday.